Well, good afternoon or good morning or good evening, wherever you are. We have not had a Patent Leaders in Learning and Literacy webcast for some time due to COVID and Corona. And actually this particular webcast is being conducted in my living room, which is exciting too. And of course, I'm absolutely thrilled to have Dr. Louisa Moats here with us in this first webcast post-COVID or in COVID to talk about Teaching Reading is Rocket Science, the updated seminal article recently released again by the American Federations of Teachers. We have been a long-term friend of Dr. Moats and honored to say so at Patent. Patent has supported letters, language essentials for teachers of reading and spelling for many, many years now, with my predecessor, Deb Fulton, as a state lead, and now myself as state lead at Patent. We are firmly committed to the science of reading at Patent and honored to say that Pennsylvania has the most letters trainers in the country. We all know, and I'll speak for myself, that letters changes lives. It certainly changed mine, and it's been the entry point for many folks on the road to the science of reading. Dr. Moats has been, a leading expert in literacy for many decades now, a teacher, a researcher, a school psychologist, and she's mentored many, many, many of the most esteemed literacy giants in the field. When you talk to them and you say, how did you start? Over and over again, you hear the name Louisa Moats. And I can still remember being an IDA maybe 5 or 6 years ago at the conference. And I was in the elevator and a bunch of people came in and said, oh my gosh, we just saw Louisa. And I think I said to Louisa at the time when I got to talk to her that she's like a one name researcher well known across the entire world. No one had to say Louisa who. We all knew it was Dr. Louisa Moats. So we are deeply indebted to you, Dr. Moats, for all that you teach us, for all that you continue to teach us, for your steadfast support of teachers and their need and to have the science of reading at their forefront so that they can teach kids to read. So I wanted to start with a question about the first Teaching Reading is Rocket Science that was written in 1999. What brought you to that journey? Kind of where did you start and how did you get to write that seminal article? And then what caused you to update it or to ask for it to be updated? It's kind of become a mantra in the field. Teaching reading is rocket science. It's on t-shirts for IDA and mugs and everything else. And I think it really exemplifies what you convey in both of these articles, that teaching reading is a complex skill that requires deep knowledge and expertise, and our teachers deserve that. And unfortunately, for many of them, I'll speak for myself, we didn't have that opportunity in college or certification. So what caused you to write the first Teaching Reading is Rocket Science? How did you get there?
Well, I was in Washington, D.C. between 1997 and 2002 as the co-principal investigator on one of the NICHD large longitudinal grants. And our job at the time was to show that in selected high poverty minority schools, we could implement, quote, reading science and demonstrate that kids, a population of kids at risk in schools that were low performing could actually learn to read if we did the right things with them. So I was right there in Washington, and the national office of the American Federation of Teachers is there. It was a few blocks away from my office in the DC public schools. And I already had a relationship with the editor of American Educator, who was a wonderful, wonderful woman who early on was following reading science, and in 1995 the AFT had published a groundbreaking issue all about the science of reading. Marilyn Adams had an article in there, and I forget who else, but people whom we quote a lot. And I had an article in there on the missing foundation in teacher education, which the AFT had picked up on because I had written an article very similar to that for the International Dyslexia Association a year or so before. And when I wrote the first article in which I pointed out that in my role as a graduate school faculty member, I was discovering that the wonderful, self-selected, well-meaning, hardworking teachers who were coming into my courses simply did not know anything about the structure of language or the psychology of reading, and ideas that had become second nature to me because I was fortunate enough to have good doctoral training and a lot of contact with the research community, that I realized and then petitioned for the idea that we just were not teaching, we're not preparing teachers to teach reading in any way that would make a difference. So because the editor at the AFT had picked up on that idea and had published my article in 1995, along with a lot of others, when I came to Washington a couple of years later, we were sort of in touch, and she was also putting together a follow-up issue in 1998. So around that time, I was very visible in Washington. I had testified to Congress several times because of my role in the project. I was entertaining members of Congress in school site visits. I was attending high-level meetings because I was right there in everybody's backyard. And the editor proposed that I write this kind of manifesto. She thought it deserved, the whole topic deserved one big, thoroughly written, white paper, if you will, about the issue of teacher preparation and reading instruction. Because, believe it or not, 20 years ago, all of the research that could support good practices and that was supporting what we were doing in DC with great success, I might add, was already there. And the National Reading Panel had been convened. It was already at work. It published its findings the year after I wrote the Reading Rockets, the Reading Science, Reading is Rocket Science paper, excuse me. And interestingly enough, and I'll never forget this, I went to the session that Donald Langenberg, I think his name was, who was the leader, the administrator of the National Reading Panel, and who was charged with presenting the findings to Congress. And I went to that meeting. A lot of the members of the panel were there, and I was there because, it was down the street. And he led off his talk to the congressional committee by saying teaching reading is rocket science, and I know because I'm a rocket scientist. And I'll never forget that. And I thought, okay, there's something about this phrase that
what made you, Dr. Moats, what made you think about that? Or I guess,
okay,
I'd love to know that.
Okay, here's the truth behind the story behind the story. I did not come up with that title. It was the staff at the AFT.
Wow.
That the paper needed a title. And it was Marcia Berger, who was the literacy specialist at the time, and a sort of committee of the editors who came up with a title.
Wow,
So
that is something.
Yeah, the AFT owns that title.
Oh, how wonderful. And how wonderful 20 years later to still have that relationship and that support. Yes. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Wow.
Yeah, and one other thing, I remember at the time I had several meetings as the paper was being developed. I had several meetings with at the AFT office, and they had called in some state representatives for the AFT to review what I was drafting. And I remember having knockdown arguments with them about the content that I was writing. There was still a big influence of whole language on their thinking.
Mm-hmm.
They did not want me to talk so much about phoneme awareness and phonics.
Oh my
Uh,
goodness.
but
But you
fortunately,
did.
the better minds prevailed, and there we go.
Oh my goodness. And so in 1999, it was right before the National Reading Panel, so it's nice kind of they're next to one another in terms of release. How did the field respond to teaching reading as rocket science? I will say in letters, when we do the Scarborough's reading rope, oftentimes, Dr. Tolman and others will do it with ropes. And we'll talk about the complexity of skilled reading, but then we'll say, teaching reading is rocket science. And the efficacy that brings to teachers, especially teachers in the early grades. I'll speak for myself. I was a kindergarten teacher for most of my career. And there was this misperception that, I was just in there playing with kids, and which of course I was. We were engaged in lots of play, but also intentional expert teaching, and to teaching them to read as a first teacher that they have. And so I think it also gives teachers some competence and efficacy to say, like, what I'm doing is rocket science, is expert, requires expert knowledge and deep knowledge of language and expertise, pedagogical expertise as well. But how did the field respond to the 1999 release of
Well,
Teaching Reading as Rocket Science?
it kind of shocked me, but I mean, it had a huge circulation, several 100,000 copies. I ended up on reading lists in courses across the country, and and it's been widely quoted and widely cited. And I think it was because I had said something about just what you mentioned, which is that teaching, the complexity of teaching, the challenge of being a good teacher, the challenge of teaching kids how to read is so underappreciated by our society. And teachers are so underappreciated and underpaid in many places for what they do. And the preparation that's required and the kind of professional nurturing that's required to develop that expertise that we're talking about is hard to find. It's hard to find states that support what what would be really good preparation, the amount of time that it takes, the investment that it takes. And it's a vicious cycle, because if teachers are paid poorly, they can't pay for an
Right.
extensive, involved preparation sequence. They have to get to work to pay their bills, which they can barely do anyway, and then to leave it up to teachers to pay their own tuition in a course that's going to be more substantive, or that's going to take them to a conference where they can hear people who really know what they're talking about. It just doesn't happen on the scale that we want. And so there continues to be, and I know you will ask me what led to the revival, the
Yes,
rewrite.
yes. I definitely am
Um,
interested in that.
yeah, and so what led to the rewrite was a kind of paradox, which is that on one hand, we have made very little progress on the issues that I talked about, which we can go into in some detail here if we want.
We do.
Um, and at the same time, we have a robust, consolidated science that does show us what kids need to learn and why they need to learn it, and that has shown us even more about the basic psychological dynamics of learning to read, and that has shown us more about the importance of certain components of instruction. Now,
Hmm.
it's not a perfect science in that it doesn't explain everything, especially when it gets to the details of how to move through the content when we're teaching kids, or which activities are the most robust for what. But nevertheless, we have a lot to hang our hats on, and even more than we had. We have, 20 years on, and the Reading League, as you know,
Hmm.
is about to disseminate the next issue of its journal on a kind of update of what we know about all the components of reading, from from the time of the National Reading Panel report. We have 20 more years of research. So it was a combination of the Center for the Development of Learning and the AFT, who co-sponsored this paper, agreeing that we weren't moving quickly enough. And we weren't moving, and in fact, in some ways had gone backwards. And the acknowledgement that there was more evidence on which to stake these claims.
Yeah, I think in the paper I read that you wrote teaching reading is rocket science, but it's also established science. And I've often heard you call it settled science. But we know, and I was reviewing one of your presentations that you did for Middle Tennessee State, that conference, the Fox conference. And I saw this graphic where we had researchers on one side, I think it's by Carolyn Cowan. And then we have educators on the other side, and we have this like abyss in between. And so do you want to talk a little bit about how that contributes? I think because the science is settled and established, but translating that into practice and getting that out is such a challenge. I think that's part of the reason, of course, too, for the update in the teaching reading is rocket science, but also challenging for how does that information get to the teacher at the teacher level. One thing I can say in terms of maybe with COVID and coronavirus that has been a bit of a silver lining is you've seen many organizations that are based in the science of reading offering lots of free professional learning. And you have seen masses of teachers participating in those professional learnings, because the barrier in the sense of if you're a teacher in a school district and this is what your PD is supported by your district, this is what you get. But there's been a lot of professional learning out that is high quality. Of course, the Reading League places all their trainings on the YouTube channel for free. Patton did a literacy symposium that which you were a keynote. Thank you. And that's also free. So do you think that these different platforms are helping or hindering getting kind of that information out there to teachers who might not have had the opportunity if they were just locked into the professional learning of their school district and it was not aligned with the science of reading?
Oh, it's helping tremendously. And I see movement in some unexpected places. More state departments who are taking to heart the need to get a different message out there and provide some leadership and guidance. I mean, even here in Idaho, I can't believe it. Idaho is one of 4 states that has no guidelines about dyslexia.
Oh my goodness.
No accountability for how anybody teaches
How
anything.
do you live there?
I have done almost no work here, but and it's very hard because, of course, parents complain to me a lot about what their kids are not getting, and I'm glad that I don't have kids in. I shouldn't say this, but anyway, so I'll leave that one. But the state is moving toward writing a better comprehensive literacy plan with some teeth in it that has more of the right information. They're very late to the party, but at least they're getting there. Wyoming, of all places, just did a huge extended literacy symposium all online. And we have other states. Massachusetts has just revised what it's doing, Rhode Island. These are states that, where I've had a role of some kind in consulting or doing a presentation or something like that. Nevertheless, we have to then say, well, what are the barriers? Why isn't everybody getting with
because
it?
I know you've heard this, Dr. Moats, I'm sure a million times more than I have as a letters trainer, but every time I do a letters training, I hear, why am I just hearing this now? Like, why did I not know this knowledge before now? And honestly, myself and others, I'll say like almost like the 7 stages of grief. Because as teachers, and this is the thing, Dr. Moats, you're always advocating for teachers. We are in there every day wanting to do the best for our kids. We want to help them learn how to read. We agonize over those who cannot. We're out there trying to figure it out on our own. But this knowledge is settled science and established science. It's been around for so long. And yet there isn't a letters training that I've done where I haven't had someone say, why was this knowledge kind of kept from me? So it's frustrating, and anger and guilt and all those things.
Yeah.
Um, so
Yeah.
thank you for creating letters with Dr. Tolman
Yeah.
and the other national letters
Yeah.
trainers, because it's making a massive impact.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I like to say to teachers who've gone through that grieving process and that more enlightened embrace of good practice and better information is, please write a letter to the dean of whatever school is
Mm-hmm.
near you, or whatever state department represents you, or whatever district, and be vocal and tell them that they're not
Right.
they're not doing the right stuff. And it's so hard. My little hometown in Vermont has
Mm-hmm.
one little school, and the learning specialist there is this lovely woman who stays in touch with me, and she
Mm-hmm.
follows the research and goes to the right conferences, and she can't get her superintendent to pay attention to what she's saying.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yes. Yeah.
it's
There's
so
lots of teachers in
frustrating,
that place too.
because I think this term balanced literacy has a kind of intuitive appeal for people. So if they haven't dug into the subject matter, they think, oh, that sounds good.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that's balanced, it has to be something better than something that's imbalanced.
Right.
That's the opposite of balance, is imbalance. Well, nobody wants to be imbalanced.
Out of balance, but
And it's
that's
all
exactly
just
what our
red
kids
herring.
need, in the sense that they need intentional focus. The focus changes over time, right? In the article too, of course, you talk about the simple view of reading and these theoretical models that ground us in this science, at the forefront, and how very few folks really know about these frameworks and how they are dynamic. They inform everything that we should be doing, our instruction or intervention or scheduling, the curriculum materials that we purchase, the professional learning that we engage in. But that knowledge is just not out there. I know myself, when I finish my doctorate, I have to beg friends for research, because I had to find somebody who's in a doctoral program or a graduate and say, can you get me this research? Because once you're out of a university, it's very difficult to get access, and very expensive to get access to research. So there's
Yes,
that
you're
side of it
right.
too.
You're right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when an open access paper comes out that's high quality, I'm like sharing it everywhere I can, because there's no barrier then.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So you talked about the reaction to the 1999 Teaching Reading as Rocket Science, and thank you for that little background information. That's really so interesting. So now it's 2020, 20 years later, 21. What has been the response to this particular article? I know, of course, as soon as it went out, the whole literacy community kind of went wild. But what kind of feedback are you hearing? And as you said, you're setting out in the original and in this one, you're making very specific guidelines, recommendations. I mean, there's no ambiguity here. There's a lot of explicitness. And so what has been the reaction, and how do you hope people use this information, as they likely did before, but now what is your hope in terms of how they use it to make change? So you cite, for example, at the state level, Mississippi and others that are really making this big change towards the science of reading, because as well, this is so much an equity issue. Without systems leadership, we have these islands of excellence of teachers, and it very much depends on the luck of the draw. If you're the lucky kid who ends up in the classroom of a teacher who's gone through letters or has had the knowledge of language and how to teach reading, you luck out. But if you don't end up in a classroom of a teacher who has not yet had that opportunity, there's such inequity in all of this. So I guess, what do you hope will happen as a result?
Well, I hope that more people who are maybe not already convinced of the need to embrace the science and really learn better practices will pause and reconsider the difference between some of the ideas that are very popular and that have driven reading instruction for the last 10 years in particular,
Mhm.
and will open their minds to changing. And in particular, I'm not sure, beyond all of the evidence that I see, that the paper um, bolsters the conviction of people who already kind of embrace and understand what I'm talking about, which is a wonderful thing. I'm hoping that people in state departments, people in universities, people in professional development organizations, and heaven forbid, administrator groups who serve public schools mainly will use this as a reading and will carefully consider the recommendations. But, I think that the things that I recommend, number one, okay, it's starting with teacher preparation, that teachers, before they're licensed, get more than one course in how to teach reading. And some special ed teachers don't even get that. Can you believe
Yes, I
it?
know.
So it should start with deans in colleges of education, and the faculty, and they should sit down and consider, okay, how much time really is necessary to give people an adequate grounding in these essential components of teaching,
Mhm.
and how much and why aren't we offering, or rather requiring, a course in language for anyone who's going to be a reading teacher.
Right.
And this to me is the slowest thing to change. There are so few programs that
Yeah.
ask teachers to learn the structure of their own language so that they can explain it to kids. And we throw teachers out there and expect them to know. And in fact, we know from multiple studies, most have no clue when you say a morpheme, no clue.
Right.
They can't identify it in a word. They certainly can't explain it to kids. They certainly can't select instructional materials that would help them teach it. And I don't talk
Can you
as
point to
much.
Mississippi too to show how, when that does happen, what a difference that makes? Because in
Yeah,
Mississippi, yeah,
well, fortunately,
uh,
one of the wonderful things that's happened in the last 20
I
years,
think that we
that,
can point to some exemplars.
yeah, that we can point to examples of places, Mississippi as a state entity, but certainly there are districts and schools that have really turned things around and gotten much better results because they've been invested in doing the right stuff. But in Mississippi, fortunately, they have the wonderful support of the Barksdale Reading Institute and all that they have provided in the way of constant dissemination of better information, making it available, supporting coaching, supporting professional development. So it's much more than the Letters initiative there. It's been, Letters was part of it, but also just the consistent leadership from every aspect of state leadership, from higher ed to professional development. The legislators were on board. Everybody had a common goal. And that's what made it change. So, I'm trying to convey in the recommendations that everybody who has power needs to sit down and say, okay, we're going to offer a lot more grounding in the right stuff. And the elements that I think are so critical are, number one, basic psychology of reading out of science. So they need the cliff notes on Mark Seidenberg's book, but they need to understand things as basic as this. There is no such thing as a sight word.
Thank you for saying that.
It's a compelling finding from convergent branches of neuroscience, cognitive science, educational science. There is no such thing as a sight word. So that's the beginning of it. If you can get your head around that and realize that flashing cards at kids or just pointing at words and telling them to guess on the basis of context is so contrary to what needs to actually happen in the human brain, that those things will seem idiotic. They are idiotic. And how do they get to be
How do they
pervasive
get to be
in
into practice?
classrooms? Because
I know.
teachers
And in
don't
so
have
many
it ready.
classrooms.
Yeah.
How does
And
that?
then uh, publishers, the publishing industry. Well, they always say, well, they just give people what they're going to sell, or it's a business. They're going to sell stuff to people that they want to buy. So they always say we're not to blame. But
Are you concerned? I'm concerned now. The term "the science of reading" is pretty ubiquitous in the field.
now it's going to be
It's
co-opted.
often misunderstood, and if you ask 100 people, you'd probably get many different responses. But you do see a lot of almost like these buzzwords all of a sudden being added to curricula that is not based on the science of reading, but they're throwing. It's almost like what Emily Hanford's called a phonics patch. They're just throwing some things in there to look as if they're, moving towards the science of reading, and they're really not. It's very concerning. It's very much like almost consumer beware.
Yes,
Right.
and that's always been true, because the publishers have no integrity whatsoever as far as the truth value of what they're saying. And some of it is naive and some of it's very calculated. So we have tokenism all over the place. We have people slapping terms on the covers of things that haven't changed at all. So the consumer has to be informed and has to know where to look for good guidance. And that's where the Reading League and other responsible organizations can give very specific guidance in terms of how to review materials, what to look for, a short list of the good stuff. Some states are being, like Colorado, are being quite bold in issuing the short list of better stuff. And I just want to encourage people to pay attention to sources that can be trusted. Doesn't this sound like our present struggle with COVID?
It does. Yes, actually, the Reading League just last month released this document, like green flags and kind of red flags, things to be looking for and things that would cause some concern. And so, yes, absolutely, looking to those trusted resources. And the problem is there's so few of them, but thank goodness, we do have the Reading League, and Colorado has taken that bold step. So folks have places to go, because so oftentimes folks look to sources that they think provide this information that actually don't.
Yes.
So, yes. Okay. Anything else that you want to share around? You had two big areas: toward a curriculum for teachers of preparation and service, pre-service and service. And you talked about knowledge base. You talked about, best practices for publishers. Is there anything else that you want to highlight from that area, or where we need to go, which had 7 kind of guideposts for the field?
Yeah, well, it's all sort of a package, and where we need to go also, I think, is not only in reshaping what teachers learn prior to being licensed, and that would involve more and better coursework with substantive content that is tied to science, and it's more rigorous, not less, backed up with a test that people have to pass. And some states have pretty good, rigorous licensing tests on knowledge of reading instruction. California had an aborted attempt.
Yes, I watched your video that you made to support them. Thank you.
I mean, how misguided was that? California, California, don't get me going. But anyway, it needs to be backed up with a test, as they've done in Mississippi. There need to be specific guidelines about what a quality preparation would be. But that's not enough. That only gets people off on the right foot. And then learning how to implement and how to teach. It should not be a solitary activity. Teachers need mentors and coaches. And in this day of virtual communication, we have virtual coaching tools that are inexpensive and that should be used to help people implement the very tricky stuff about how do you present a concept, how do you provide practice, How do you move from supervised practice to independent practice? How do you handle teaching a decodable text when there isn't a whole lot of meaning in there to milk out of it? What does it look like when you're doing a reading aloud thing with novice readers, and you're trying to use that to enhance their vocabulary and their familiarity with academic language? What does it look like if you have, it's the latest thing we're really pushing, you have non-mainstream uh, English speakers, dialect speakers in your
Mm-hmm.
classroom, and you need to teach them about standard American English that they're reading in their books, and engaging code switching. And
Mm-hmm.
how do you do that in a way that does not insult the student's home language?
Right.
I mean, these
Mm-hmm.
are
And I
just
love, you say
things,
oftentimes, Louisa, the language they're loved in.
the language they're loved in.
Mm-hmm.
And these
Yes,
are
I
all
hear you say that
different
so often.
things. And I was always astonished when I was going daily to classrooms in our DC project for years, watching what was difficult for teachers to learn how to do. There's so many ins and outs of the
Mm-hmm.
implementation. So it's sort of the difference between, for a physician, you can learn anatomy, but then if you're going to learn surgery, you've got to get you've
Get
got
in
to
there.
get in there
Yep.
with a lot of close supervision. And it's
Yes.
sort of,
Feedback, error correction,
yeah,
all
and
those component parts of explicit and
to
systematic instruction.
the allocation of resources is so out of whack here. I think in countries that have higher expectations for the teaching profession, that idea of mentorship and collaboration, and okay, if you don't know how to do something, you get freed up to go watch
Somebody
your
else. Yeah, it's
colleague,
such an isolating profession.
go
I
see it.
know at Patton, when we have the honor of working with schools long term, we always have the opportunity to model best practice, have teachers do it, and have other teachers watch and give feedback. And that's so empowering to other teachers to see their colleagues teach and figure something out. So then they know, like, well, you know how to do that. I'm going to ask you. And we're very much a profession of isolation.
Yeah.
We get in there and we shut our doors and no one really knows what's going on in there. And it's such a shame because I know when I became a reading specialist, I had the opportunity to be outside my classroom. And I found that there were teachers in my school, because I was in the classroom supporting students, that were engaged in practices that I had run off to conferences to try to learn how to do. And then I came back and tried to remember, how is that done? And yet there was someone in my own school who was doing it well, but I never got out of my classroom to know that. And so I could have been being supported and coached by another teacher who really knew the practice and was in my context. But I didn't even get that opportunity to know that was happening in my school until I was a reading specialist. So it's such a shame.
And so that means that administrators, building administrators, the organizations for principals and superintendents really need to train our building level and district level
They make
leaders
all the difference.
how to implement collaborative teaching and in-class support.
Over and over again. And when we get feedback from teachers in terms of how it's changed your practice, they say, seeing my colleague do this well and knowing how then to go to someone, you see those, I had the honor of then seeing those practices transfer into other classrooms.
Yeah.
It's very exciting. Do you mind just for a moment though, talking about the knowledge and practice standards? They are included in this article. And again, oftentimes, when we're doing letters, I'm sharing the knowledge and practice standards, and I'll say how many people knew about this prior to me sharing, and very, very few hands come up. So the knowledge and practice students not only know, but also very concrete do. And of course, there's an assessment aligned to that. But do you mind just talking just a moment about that? Because you did include them in the article. And I do think it's something that a lot of folks in the field don't seem to be aware of.
Well, yeah, I think maybe, well, for one thing, are you referring to the IDA knowledge and
Yes, I'm
practice?
sorry. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Um, the IDA needs to do a much better job, I think, with dissemination of and promotion of those standards. But maybe then that could be taken on also by the Reading League and other organizations that see that these standards are not just about dyslexia. And I think one of the inhibitory factors has been that it was the IDA through the Center for Effective Reading Instruction that published these. And so out of hand, people reject them who think that whatever a teacher does for a kid who has struggles with reading could not possibly be
help
for the rest.
I just had an open mic night last night with teachers using effective, efficient instructional routines. And they actually were showing, it's so glad that you brought that up. They showed data of all their kids and looked at their student growth percentiles. And the student who was the highest performing student at the benchmark was the one who had the most improvement. The group, and they were in there doing the same practices, but they were saying like it didn't harm this gifted student to be engaged in these direct, explicit, and I was just like, I'm going to take that slide, I'm going to share it everywhere, because everyone was growing, right? Our kids who were at risk were growing quite a bit as well, but it wasn't harming the student who was gifted. And I think it's back to the Snowlink quote, basically, and the citation. It was that, phonics is beneficial for all and harms none, right? And so these students were becoming much more aware of language in depth.
Yes.
All of them, but it wasn't harming the student. This particular school district is in a university, a very large university town. And so the parents were kind of like, what are you doing all this direct explicit instruction around, teaching word recognition skills and language comprehension, but they were kind of concerned, and they were like, well, let's kind of look at our data here. Yeah. Your child is growing more and faster than anyone in this classroom. Yeah. So that's the thing. I think we need more of that. More sharing of that, especially when it comes from the teachers who are doing it. They were absolutely on fire for the science of reading and the impact this pedagogical practices were having on all their students. But it's empowering. And then now another school is going to be doing it, so it builds that way, I guess.
That's just.
But they had one component that we've talked about a lot in this chat is about leadership. Their school administrator was there, their principal, as well as a central administrator. And they're in a very, very whole language school district. And they were able to kind of nest this into this one school. And now all of a sudden all the other schools are like, what's going on over there?
Well, at least they're asking, right? At least they're asking.
They're asking. Well, and they're replicating. They're starting to move into that replication. So when a leader takes a step out to support the science of reading, supports their teachers, it's I always say behavior precedes belief. They were behaving in ways that were based on the science of reading, behaviors of pedagogical practices, and then their students learned, and they're believers. So difficult to believe people into new ways of behaving, but if we can support them in behaving in ways that are more effective, and their students learn, they become born again for the science of reading,
which is wonderful.
It is wonderful. It really is. It was a great night last night. Yeah. So is there anything else that you would like to share about the article? Any other recommendations that you really feel were the key that you would want to key in before we close up?
I just want to point out that another impetus for rewriting this was we have had 10 years of the implementation of the Common Core state standards to no effect. Right? Yes. No national effect, and some backsliding of minority groups and some backsliding in various states, with Mississippi being and Washington D.C. being the only standouts. So this is the advantage of being as old as I am and seeing how these movements in education play out over time. And when the Common Core came about, and I had a little hand in that.
Yes, I know you did.
Struggling to try to get the right emphasis without much success. I could see it all. I could just see it all coming. And here we are. That is not the way you make a difference. The way you make a difference is to ensure that kids get really solid grounding in language processing, language structure, and academic language proficiency. Because when they have these skills, they'll be off to a running start and
Yes.
will get on that growth trajectory of
Right.
accelerated reading volume, which leads to, you know, all the benefits that accrue. And
We
so
need
even,
very effective teachers in those early grades. And as I said before, I know, my main teaching years were kindergarten. And so often I would meet people and they said, well, what do you do? Oh, I said, oh, I teach kindergarten. They would go, oh, you must love playing all day. So I think there's and of course, being on the playground with my kids, love that. But I wanted to say, like, I'm in there teaching a child to read. And that's a lifelong skill, and the joy of that. My husband would always say, you're happiest in the spring, because my kids were consolidating, everything and becoming readers, and they were like on fire for it. But so many times early educators in those early grades, they are not necessarily revered as much as maybe your high school physics teacher or what have you. That I think there's a misunderstanding about the expertise, which I'm not telling you anything you don't know, and that these early educators really need to be so grounded in.
Yeah, you are so right on, Pam. Absolutely. And you've lived through all this and
Oh,
are
yeah.
so able to express the whole dynamic.
Oh, it's fun.
The
So I
results
know you have a granddaughter, yes?
do. She's 3, and
I've seen you. I saw a video you did with her, where you were singing her "You Are My Sunshine."
yeah.
I thought, how lucky for that child to have Louisa Moats as her grandmother. But I guess maybe we'll end by saying, like, what do you hope for your granddaughter and for all children, as we move forward?
Well, I just hope that in another 20 years, we don't need a version of this paper anymore. And that's probably hoping for a lot, because this field has been so entrenched in bad thinking on so many fronts. And in
Mm-hmm.
major districts, they're still doing, all the
Right,
stuff
and you have a
on
lot of teachers kind of in
too.
secret
People
doing
are
the science of
still,
reading.
uh, so in order for that to happen, another thing I hope might be associated with a renaissance in education, if things turn in the right direction here, would be not only a course in civics and civic duty, like you got to vote, but also how science works, because there's just
Yes.
general naivete in people who only study the humanities and have no grounding in the scientific process.
Mm-hmm.
How the process unfolds over time. That could be part, and I think should be part of teacher education and public education in general, and that might help us out on a number of fronts.
It might.
Yeah, so that's the, we've covered a lot of
We
territory.
have.
I hope people
Yeah.
read the paper. I have not
Oh,
yet.
everyone's reading. Everyone's reading
Yeah,
it,
well, I
Dr. Moats.
haven't been. I haven't. I don't mean to ask for this, but I haven't yet been targeted by hate mail or anything. So I'm hoping that what I have to say does strike a chord, and that it will propel people into continuing their action on this front and their commitment on this front. And that's really what I hope for.
Yeah, and you've laid out all the details to guide us, as you have for so many years, Dr. Moats. Truly, you leave such a legacy, and the legacy continues. You continue and steadfast. And I was looking at your research articles on teacher education. It's like this long, and it started in 1994. Like, you are steadfast, and you have contributed so much to the field and mentored so many truly grateful for everything that you've done for the entire world, but also in particular what you've done for educators in Pennsylvania and at Patton in our intermediate units. We are truly grateful.
And I'm
Thanks
so
to
grateful
everybody.
to you. I'm
Oh,
so grateful to you for your leadership. It's making a huge difference, and I thank you so much. It's very
oh,
inspiring.
oh, thank you, Dr. Moats. Okay, so on that wonderful note, we'll end this Patent Leaders in Learning and Literacy webcast. Again, what an honor it's been to have Dr. Moats here talk about teaching reading is rocket science, what expert teachers need to know and be able to do. Make sure if you haven't read it that you read it. Take care, everyone.